Hello, class. Sorry that I couldn't be here today. Currently out of town. I'm in New York right now for a wedding. So thank you for doing an awesome job so far today. Today we're just going to quickly go over the notes that I have for our explorers and our colonies for the first British colonies that established those 13 colonies that you just learned about through our round room activity. So the first colony that I want to start with, and please make sure that you are jotting down these notes in your notes section of the notebook. Additionally, make sure that you're practicing those shorthand notes that we talked about before. So trying to summarize ideas, use that text language like we talked about. Remember, these are your notes, so as long as you can read them, you're going to be good. I'm not grading them, I'm not looking through them, reading them for correct spelling. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So the earliest known British colony is in Roanoke, Virginia. And Sir Walter Raleigh in 1587 decided to attempt an establishment of a colony in the Americas. His first intention to land was Virginia, but we didn't really know the exact boundaries of these places yet. So he ultimately lands in modern-day North Carolina, which, as we can see down here from our map, is this location on these islands in North Carolina. Now, again, he intended to land clear up here in Virginia, and at the time we declared this area a Virginia territory, hence the reason why we get Roanoke, Virginia. But in modern day, it is North Carolina. Now, Roanoke was fairly unique in the sense that it was the first attempted colony to be established by the British. And the truth of the fact is, it was an absolute disaster, unfortunately. So in 1587, when Sir Walter Raleigh first arrived, they established their colony on those islands. Eventually, after a short period of time, Sir Walter Raleigh realizes that they needed more supplies, that they just didn't have enough supplies to continue to survive. So he decides to return to England for supplies, and he left the majority of his followers or his settlers in Roanoke in hopes of them surviving, establishing roots in that territory, and then when he returned with supplies, they could continue to expand. However, as soon as he gets back to England, war with Spain ultimately breaks out, and we're going to have about a 3-year war between Spain and England, during which England will ultimately kind of become the major power of Europe at that time. So he could not return until he could not return until 1590. However, as soon as he returns, the colony's gone. There's hardly any evidence showing that it still existed. Everything was a rubble. All the people were gone. Supplies were gone. It just disappeared. And the only thing they ended up finding was the word Croatoan inscribed on a tree or a post. Unfortunately, we don't have the tree or the post anymore, but we do have replicas of the tree, which I'll show you here in a second. Now, there are a lot of theories about what happened to the Roanoke colony, but ultimately, we're not 100% sure. The most believable theories, there's about 4 of them. Number 1 is that the colonists ultimately just kind of died off. They couldn't survive the new territory, and disease may have gone rampant. Number 2, they integrated with the Native American populations as they needed a source of survival. So they thought by integrating with the Native American population they could survive. Number 3, maybe there was a Native American population around them that was aggressive and hostile, and therefore they went through and ultimately killed all of the colonists of Roanoke. And the 4th most plausible answer is that there was a hurricane. As we know, hurricanes do tend to land in these areas of the East Coast. So the idea is that a hurricane ultimately destroyed the colony as it moved forward. So here's an image of what we assume that we kind of saw as they came back. It's this word Croatoan. Again, with the word Croatoan, we don't exactly for sure know what it means. Now we speculate, we theorize. Remember we talked about history being a theory. We theorize that Croatoan may have been a Native American group, or it could have been a Native American word that was either threatening or a forewarning. However, again, we're not 100% sure, and this is just a replica of what we kind of thought we saw. Now, the second major British colony that was established and was successful, considered the first successful colony, is Jamestown, Virginia. Jamestown, Virginia, again, is fairly unique, as we're going to see here in a second. It struggled at first, very much so. So by this point, 1607, as I mentioned in the previous slide, England has become the superpower of England, or sorry, England has become the superpower of Europe. And since they become this powerful nation, they realize they need to start expanding and they need to start setting up successful routes. So a particular company called the Virginia Company of London asked the king for a charter. And a charter is essentially a written permission to receiving funds and permission to travel to the New World or travel to the 13 colonies, which will later be known as, and establish a colony in which the resources that they gain from this colony will be shared through profit back to the King of England or to the government of England. And ultimately the King of England says yes, and he funds the Virginia Company, and the Virginia Company travels to Virginia and established or founded the colony of Jamestown. The individual who led this journey was Captain Christopher Newport, and he lands in Virginia in 1607, so almost 20 years after Roanoke was first established. However, they chose a very bad location. The location that they started to build their colony on is a swamp. And if any of you are from or have been to Virginia before, you know that in that area there is a lot of swampland. And if anyone knows, what kind of insects do swamps have a lot of that carry diseases? Mosquitoes. So, in the first year, from 1607 to 1608, of the 500 colonists who started to establish Jamestown, 460 are going to die from diseases carried by mosquitoes, most commonly at the time, malaria. So, very unsuccessful. And ultimately, what they have to start doing is shipping over more colonists to this territory in order to continue to establish it. But in addition to the bad swampland, Jamestown had one more problem. And that's the fact that the rich colonists, who came over looking to become even more wealthy, but maybe to also escape any persecution from the English government, refused to work. They believe they are superior, that the inferior immigrants or the inferior colonists should have to do the work for them, should have to supply the goods for them, and ultimately they just refuse to work. So during this process, as England begins to continue to send more and more colonists over to Jamestown to try and make it a successful colony, a particular leader comes forth in the name of John Smith. And some of you have heard of John Smith before. Does anyone know what Disney movie he's in? Pocahontas is the correct answer. So John Smith is sent to save this colony because of his kind of brute leadership and his strict rules. So he ultimately says that the person who does not work shall not eat, referring to the rich colonists, saying to the rich colonists, hey, if you're not going to work at all, then you're not going to eat. And if you're not going to eat, obviously, you're not going to survive. So it was this idea that everyone had to partake and participate in the workforce in order to create a successful colony. Now, John Smith, just so you know, John Smith at no point ever had a relationship with Pocahontas in real history. That is kind of a twist by Disney. In fact, John Smith was about 15 years older than Pocahontas. So during that time period when John Smith first arrived to Jamestown, he was in his late 20s to early 30s. And Pocahontas, from the evidence that we have, was about 13 years old. So there was a huge age difference. And in fact, from all the documents, the primary sources that we have, John Smith may have met Pocahontas twice, in the fact that he merely just saw her as he was speaking to the Native American tribe that Pocahontas is from. And we'll kind of go over that a little bit more when I come back. But Disney, obviously, exaggerated, twisted the truth, but John Smith did not have a relationship with Pocahontas. Pocahontas does end up marrying a John later, but it is John Rolfe, not John Smith. So the major success that comes out of Jamestown is what we call the House of Burgesses, which is established July 1619. Now, in order to have a successful colony, a successful city, once it starts to have a larger population, you have to have a government. And the House of Burgesses ultimately established what we call a representative government, in which the voters would elect people to make the laws for them. Does that sound familiar to anything we use today? Absolutely. The United States system that we run on is a representative government. As soon as you turn 18, you start to elect people who will represent you, who will ultimately pass laws and represent you and your beliefs in the government system or the beliefs of the majority as hopes. So we can see that our government as early as 1619 is already starting to kind of take hold in Jamestown. Remember that idea of House of Burgesses? So we're going to come back to that soon. The third and final successful colony that I want to discuss here today comes with the Pilgrims. Now, a pilgrim, some of you might have heard that term before. Ultimately, a pilgrim is a person who takes a religious journey. And there are a lot of different pilgrimages around the world. The most common, if anyone knows it, is probably the Islamic pilgrim, as Muslims will make the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is their religious journey. In this case, our pilgrims were a more of a Christian, kind of a mix between Protestant and Catholic beliefs who took a religious journey to the New World. Now, the reasoning for this is pilgrims in England ultimately do not agree with the newly established Church of England, which we're going to call Protestants. And they don't also agree with the Catholics or Catholicism of the time, because Catholicism was the main religion across Europe for the most part at this time, had a lot of influence, but it also created a lot of problems for people who tried to practice new and different religions. The Protestants, they felt, were too loosey-goosey, I'm going to say, meaning they weren't strict enough in certain aspects of the religion. So they didn't agree with either one. So ultimately, however, they experienced religious intolerance or persecution from both sides, both the Protestants and the Catholics. I mean, we're talking pilgrims being marred, being killed, hung, stoned, imprisoned, persecuted for crimes they did not commit. You name it, and most likely they experienced it. So during the early 1600s, they actually escaped to the Netherlands to start their kind of attempt to become free. By 1620, William Bradford is actually going to lead the pilgrimage or lead a journey of 100 pilgrims to the New World for safety. And they're going to take him on, or he's going to take them on, a boat called the Mayflower. And after a couple months at sea, they eventually land in the New World. They land in Massachusetts and create the city of, or the colony of Plymouth. However, a couple notes about this. Number one, William Bradford and the Pilgrims intended to actually land in Virginia. They knew that the colony of Jamestown was in Virginia, and they were hoping to be able to establish colonial roots near Jamestown. However, they got fairly lost at sea, and if you look at your map of the 13 colonies, you can see that they landed way north of Virginia, clear in Massachusetts. So it was an accident that they ultimately landed in Massachusetts, not on purpose, and often it is acclaimed to have happened because no one on these boats really knew how to navigate. So they did land in Massachusetts, and they did create a successful colony in Plymouth. Now, I've gone over a whole bunch of notes, and we have one more slide here. But all of this information, what do you think that can be used on? These specifics can be used on at the end of the year that you just recently took. Your post-test or your pre-test that you just took. Remember when I talked about using more specific information by the end of the year? And I gave the example of pilgrims and religious intolerance in the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock or Plymouth Colony. Those are the kind of words we're going to be asking you to use by the end of the year. So I do hope that you're jotting these notes down and getting these important facts. One more slide and then we'll kind of move on. Now Plymouth, just as Jamestown, needed rules to run the colony. Now, instead of establishing the rules way later, like Jamestown does, they established the rules on the boat before they even landed in Massachusetts, in which they created what they called the Mayflower Compact. Mayflower, named after if I go back, the boat that they travel on called the Mayflower. Now, the idea with the Mayflower Compact is the idea that the government would make just and equal laws by officials elected by Colonies adults. Sounds fairly familiar to the House of Burgesses, sort of, doesn't it? The idea that you have elected officials by adults, and they're creating just and equal laws. Now, why do you think just and equal laws were so important to the Pilgrims? Likely because of the religious persecution that they faced when they were still in England or still in Europe. So they wanted to create just and equal laws for all religions, practice religious tolerance, meaning accepting of different religions, and we're going to start to notice that the Massachusetts area and surrounding colonies are going to thrive on several, we're talking tons of different religious practices. And as they do that, we will become a very diverse religious area in that region, which will expand throughout the rest of the United States, which creates the United States that we have today and the vast amount of different religions practiced across the whole country. As we saw, it is similar to the House of Burgesses, but it ultimately influences our modern government too. Again, the idea of representative government elected by colonies adults, and also the idea of equality amongst the groups, amongst the religions, amongst the adults. And we're going to see that kind of continue to expand with Plymouth. I'm going to go ahead and stop right there.